Hi everyone, welcome to the very first video lecture in PR70, the 15 years I've been teaching the course. It's the first time I'm trying a video lecture. I'd be very interested in getting your reactions to it, positive, negative, neutral, whatever. I'd like to know if it works. I'd like to know how we can make it better. I'd like to know if you hate it. I'd like to know if you love it. So please let me know. Our focus for today, our agenda for today is survey research, quantitative research. As I told you the very first day we met, this is really the essence of PR research. This is what it's all about. And it's incredibly important. And the beautiful part about the way this semester is working out is we're going to get a chance to do some live work with survey data. We're going to be able to field, I hope, a little online survey. And you'll be able to get the data. You'll be able to create some questions. You'll be able to see the data come back at you and analyze it and write a little report, all in class. None of it. The only thing that will involve any work outside of class will be a development of a few questions. We're going to break it up into groups so everybody doesn't have to write a whole questionnaire. And we'll talk about that as we go through. By the way, welcome to my home office. It's a joy to welcome you here and to share with you some insights about survey research. What we're going to do today, we'll go through and we'll talk about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. We'll talk about the types of surveys that are out there. We'll talk about the real essence. We're going to talk about the advantage, by the way, and disadvantage of each type of research. The essence of what we're going to do today is continue our discussion from last week about questionnaire design, because that's really the most important piece that's going to be practically important to you. And we'll talk a little bit about that beloved four-letter word data, and it comes to bear in terms of statistics and sampling and how you create a sample. So, having said all of those things, let me just give you a quick reminder on where we're holding in terms of the semester and what's coming up between now and the end of the semester. So you'll be watching this someplace around April 15th, tax day. Oh, is it taxing? And I would ask you to get to me by end of business tomorrow, the 16th, questionnaires. We're going to do this. We're going to have 10 questions, 3 groups. Each one of you will draft 10 questions. We'll go through that in a couple of minutes. Go through that when we get to the questionnaire section. So that'll come in tomorrow. I will get back to you, God willing, by Thursday, a link to an online survey. You'll send that out to as many people as you can. They'll fill it out, and by the time we get back to class on the 28th, I guess it's when I'm kind of losing track of time here. 28th. On the 28th, we should have data to work with, and we'll have some fun looking at live research data and figuring out what it all means and figuring out how to turn that into prose, into golden copy, as they say. So that'll be happening in class on the 28th. Let's see, between now and then we got a couple other things happening. We have focus group report coming in. By the way, some of you have not sent me your focus group highlights. If you don't do that, you're at a disadvantage because you won't get my insights in terms of what you're coming up with as highlights. If you send them to me, I will get them back to you as quickly as I possibly can. Focus group report comes in by email by midnight on Tuesday, April 22nd. That's a week from Tuesday, April 22nd. And that really, is the end of the heavy lifting. We'll be meeting on the 28th, on either the 30th or the 1st, depending on what we work out finally. And then we'll be meeting, our final class session will be on, I guess it's Monday, May 5th. And at that time we'll have a couple of quizzes. You'll have some options in terms of revising work and getting stuff in. Whatever would work for you. Okay, so let's get underway. Let's talk about surveys. They're the essence of PR research. And let's talk about why that is. Why are surveys, why is quantitative research such an important thing in the PR research world? Well, it's important because it's the bread and butter of PR research, really. This is the kind of survey, this is the kind of research you do when you want to measure image, when you want to find out just where your client stands, when you want to measure the effectiveness of a PR program. You're not going to do it with focus groups. You're not going to do it with secondary research. You're going to do it with survey data. We're going to do it by going out and collecting collecting data that is projectable to the universe. And that's the real key to this whole thing. Projectable to the universe. That's what sets all of this apart. And the reason it's projectable to the universe is that because you create a sample, and we'll talk about sampling design a little bit later on in the lecture. So let me tell you a little bit about what sets quantitative research apart from qualitative research. So the essential considerations here have to do with sampling, with the length of an interview, with the types of questions that you're going to use, and with the projectability of the data that you collect. So let's talk about that. So when we did focus groups, we had a long interview. We had like an hour-long interview. And we used open-ended questions. The key, however, was that you could only project those results. You could only talk about those results in terms of the people you interviewed. If you do enough of the groups, sometimes you get a sense of how an audience might perceive things. But the reality is, the absolute reality is, that's not the case. Sometimes you pretend it is, but in reality, that's not the case. The case is the data that you collect in focus groups is projectable to the group, period. It doesn't go beyond that. You used open-ended questions. The key words in those questions were how and what and maybe why. It's different when you get into quantitative surveys, with one exception that we'll get to in a minute. Right. The data is projectable to the universe when you use random sampling. Random sampling is the key to this. Random sampling is what enables you to talk to 1,000 people and have them represent a population that could be 1 million, 2 million, 50 million if you draw the sample in the right way. And that is a big deal. That is what makes these surveys so important. You're able to collect a sample where everyone in a population has an equal chance of being selected. As long as that is the case, that's called random sampling. There are variations of it to be sure, but the basic approach is as long as you have random sampling, everybody has a chance to be selected, your data will be projected to the audience to the universe, the audience that you're targeting. Let's move on and let's talk about the various types of surveys that are out there. There are essentially 4 types of surveys that we're going to discuss. There are face-to-face surveys. They're generally one-on-one type interviews. There are phone surveys. There are what we call self-administered surveys. They're surveys that are even, they're written. They're either sent out in the mail or they're given to a group of people that you put together in a single location. And there are web-based or internet surveys, and if we get, when we field our little informal survey, hopefully later this week, it will be an internet survey. First of all, let's talk about face-to-face surveys. Now, this is an anomaly, in a way, because this is a survey type that goes against the grain of quantitative surveys of the other forms, because here you can use a long interview. This form of research is designed for long interviews, usually with very well-trained interviewers. And these are used for complex issues sometimes. They're used for socio-demographic trends. They're used to identify consumer buying habits and things like that. You can show materials to a respondent. You can watch how a respondent responds. But because everybody in the sample has to get the same questionnaire administered the same way, or pretty much the same way, there isn't room here for the kind of free-form questions that you can ask in a focus group environment. Here the questions are all predetermined. The answer categories are predetermined as well. There can be some open-ended questions, but the only thing the similarity between this and qualitative research is long interviews delivered face-to-face. Now, what's the disadvantage of a face-to-face interview? Well, there are 2. They're very, very expensive to do, and they take a whole lot of time. You have to set up appointments with the right, you first have to draw a sample of, which you have to do in almost any case, but then you have to go out and find your respondents. You have to set up appointments with them. You have to train your interviewers to administer the questionnaire. You have to go out and do the field work. The interview takes a very long time, and it takes a while because you're coding this data. You're going to record this data on paper questionnaires. It takes a while. You have to code the data so that it can be tabulated, and then you have to tabulate the data and analyze it and write your report and do all the other things that you do in every kind of research. Now, the bread and butter form of research is really phone surveys. They're the ones that really, I think, give you the most bang for your buck. They give you the most bang for the buck for a lot of different reasons. You can conduct a phone survey very, very quickly. You can get a reasonably high response rate. Today there's an issue with people who are kind of antsy about responding because they don't want to participate in in what they think might be a telemarketing kind of pitch. You have to convince the respondent when you do this that it's not a telemarketing or it's not a marketing or a sales thing, it's a research thing, and usually they will go along with that. You can use a technique called random digit dialing to get a random sample. In random digit dialing, all you need to know is the codes, the area codes, the telephone exchanges that are within those codes, and you can create a sample. You can have extensive what we call branching in a questionnaire. Branching in a questionnaire is where if a respondent answers a question one way, you go to another question. And if they answer the question a different way, that brings up a different question. And what I like most about telephone research is that you're working on gut response. People are just going to give you their feelings right out of their gut. They're not going to sit around, well, do I think it's this way or do I think it's that way? You get their gut. It's very easy to tabulate this stuff. Most of these telephone surveys are done using what are called CATIE systems, computer-assisted telephone interviewing systems. The questionnaire comes up on a computer screen. The interviewer just asks the question, records the answer, goes on to the next question, and once the interview is done and the data becomes part of the set, it becomes available to the survey managers. What are the disadvantages of phone surveys? They're more costly, say, than internet surveys and probably than mail surveys. Mail surveys have a couple of other gotchas, though. And they're very dependent on the interface, the kind of conversation that you have between a respondent and the interviewer. If the interviewer has a good personality and comes across as warm and doing something that is important, that works out. But if the interviewer is someone who can barely get out sentences and doesn't seem very interested and just going through the motions, so that might not be a very, very good way of conducting an interview. One of the principal limitations of a phone survey is length. They probably can only go between about 10 or 12 minutes. You probably can't get respondents to stay on the phone much longer than that. Because of that, you have a limited number of response choices, and it's harder to use open-ended questions. It's a limited number of response choices because you have to read all the response choices to the respondent. You have to tell them what the response choices are, unless you're using a situation where you're kind of making it seem like it's an open-ended question, but they're going to give you an answer that fits into a set of categories that have been pre-coded. So, advantages of telephone surveys: quick. They're relatively quick. They're very, very quick to do. You get a reasonably high response rate. I think the most important thing is you get a gut response. Principal disadvantages: they're a little bit more costly than mail, certainly more costly than internet surveys. And they're dependent on the interviewer, and you have a limited number of response choices that you can give to the respondent. Self-administered surveys. There are two forms of these. There are group surveys, where you assemble a group and give them a written questionnaire, or sometimes it can be a computer-based questionnaire, but it's the same concept. They're in one room, and they take the survey, and then they leave. That's the great thing about that. One of the biggest advantages, you have a 99% response rate. Almost everybody who comes into the room is going to take the survey. It's very, very few people are going to walk away from the survey. And you can have long lists of response items when you do this kind of technique. You have an interviewer who's in the room. You have sort of a research manager who's in the room who can respond to questions on the spot. They won't necessarily give you the answers to the questions being asked, but they can help respondents who might have a question understanding, this or that about the research process. And you can have visual aids. You can show things to the respondents, and that can be very helpful. All right. So, what are the disadvantages of a self-administered group questionnaire? Well, you have to have direct access to the respondents. Now, students at Post and at a lot of colleges, you participate in a self-administered group research project. It's the survey that you get in every class, that asks you to evaluate that class. That's a perfect example of this kind of research. You do it in class, so everybody who's in the class gets the survey, and everybody participates. This only works though when you can get access to the group. So it's not going to work. It's not likely to work. And when you want to do customers, when you want to do a survey of customers, not very likely you're going to be able to pull a set of customers into a room and in any significant number and with a random sampling and give them a questionnaire. Can be done, but it's not usually done with customers. It's usually done with groups like students, and sometimes with employees, if they're the kinds of employees who are working in one place, and you can take them off the job for a long enough period to complete the questionnaire. Let's talk about another form of self-administered research, and that's a mail survey. So in this survey, what you do, you create a questionnaire, and you mail it out to your random sample. The advantages of doing this, it's relatively inexpensive to send out a questionnaire. Here's some relative costs, okay? Generally speaking, it costs around, let's say $15 to do a telephone interview. And it costs maybe $3 or $4 to do a mail survey, to send out a mail questionnaire. And that cost is principally involved in development of the questionnaire, and not so much the postage doesn't cost a whole lot. $1 or $1.50 is all the cost to get the thing out and get the thing back. And you sometimes have to use reminders, so there might be some additional postage expenses associated with that. It's very easy to administer this kind of questionnaire when you're dealing with large geographic areas. You have privacy. The respondent in this situation has time to think about the answers that he or she is giving you, and the respondent, is doing this. The only person who's observing the respondent in this environment is the respondent. No one else is paying any attention to what the respondent is doing. So the respondents have time to think about this, and they can also write comments on the questionnaire. What are the disadvantages? Well, the principal disadvantages is a 4-letter word, slow. This can take a long time to complete. And coupled with that, when you do mail surveys, you are subject to very low response rates. Let's say in a telephone survey you're able to get to 60 or 70% of the people you call. They'll agree to participate in your survey. It's not likely to be that way in a mail questionnaire. If you're lucky, you get 25% of the questionnaires back. You have to build this into your sampling. This becomes part of your sampling plan. You kind of guess what your response rate is going to be, and you oversample, to take that into account. So you also have a concept here called respondent self-selection. Now, self-selection means like this. Who are the people they're going to decide, respondent's going to decide whether he or she wants to participate in this survey. When you call them on the phone, they're not necessarily going to think, do I really want to talk about student satisfaction? But they're just going to talk about it, or they're not going to talk about it. Here they're going to think about it. And the people, what you find by what we mean by respondent self-selection is this. Usually what happens is the people who are really anxious to participate in this kind of study are people who are either very satisfied or very dissatisfied. The people in the middle, it's not that important to them. Whereas you get them on the phone, they're probably not going to think about, am I really happy, am I really not? They're just either going to do it or they're not going to do it. when you do a mail questionnaire, here's where you really have to have the simplest kind of survey instrument out there. You have a limited ability to create branches, and you have to make it easy for the respondent to deal with the questions. All right, the final kind of research technique that we'll talk about is the internet survey, and this has become quite popular. It's kind of a combination of a phone survey. It has the advantages and the advantages of a phone survey. Let me try it a different way. Combines the elements of a phone survey and a mail survey. It's very inexpensive to do. It can be turned around relatively quickly. And if the questionnaire is in a website, you can do a lot of branching. You can have as much branching as you could have in a telephone survey, maybe even more. You get the results. They're tabulated because of the software that you're using. They're tabulated as soon as the interview is over, as soon as the respondent fills out the questionnaire. And you can have, it's very easy for a respondent to write open-ended, to write comments. Open-ended questions are not used that often in survey research, by the way, because like you were dealing with 10 respondents, and you saw how tricky it was to go through and listen to the comments. Well, here you're dealing with a minimum sample size usually is about 1,000. Sometimes you see smaller, but not very often. And think about trying to analyze 1,000 open-ended questions coming from even though they're typed and ready to rock and roll, it still takes quite an effort to do that. So you also, by the way, have a few other advantages. You have worldwide reach. You can include people who are all over the world very easily in your sample design, and you can give people attachments. They can look at text, they can look at audio, they can look at video things, and they can respond and react to it. So what are the disadvantages of this kind of research? Well, there are a couple. The most important one is that the only people who can participate in this are people who use the internet. Now, admittedly, that number is probably in the 80% range. But there's a sharp divide in people who use the internet and people who don't. And it's a divide that goes along socio-demographic grounds. The people who are in the lower socioeconomic categories are much less likely to be internet users than the people who are in the middle or in the upper socio-demographic categories. The other problem you have here is drawing a sample. You don't have databases, you don't have random telephone numbers to choose from. You have to have email addresses to be able to truly draw a random sample. Now, people do other ways. There are other ways of doing this. They put surveys up on websites, and then they match the demographics to the to the characteristics of the population. There are a lot of ways of doing that, but it's truly not a random sampling process. It's not as clear and as clean as simple random sampling. So that's a big draw. You also have the notion of self-selection here, and of course you can't pre-code here. You have to always provide the answer categories to the respondent. Let's just do a quick review of the 4 basic kinds of survey research, of quantitative research. We have face-to-face interviews, we have phone interviews, we have 2 kinds of self-administered surveys. We have those that are administered in groups, those are administered through the mail, and finally we have internet research. Perhaps the most important part of this lecture is the next section, where we talk about questionnaire design. The reason for that is that when you're out in the field, the most likely thing you're going to be involved in is reviewing a questionnaire and perhaps writing some of the questions. So it's important to understand the techniques that go into writing questions for quantitative research for surveys. And again, the principal difference between them and the questions that we did for the discussion guide is that those were open-ended, these are close-ended, those didn't have answer categories, these do. So let's talk about the various types of questions. You know about open-ended questions. We wrote those for the discussion guide, so we're not going to talk about that. And what's a close-ended question? A close-ended question is one that has just a limited number of response categories, and that we provide the answers as well as the questions. Now, there are 2 concepts that go into good questions, and they are validity and reliability. So a valid question is a question that measures what you want to measure. And a reliable question is a question that does the same thing over and over again. Now, how do you achieve this? How do you achieve reliability and validity? You do it by using clear and concise language. Language that will be clear to all the respondents. And you make sure that all the respondents get asked the same questions the same way. And finally, you ensure that the answer categories are consistent and that they are clear. One of the things, by the way, that happens in the field, in the professional world, when you have a questionnaire, especially a new questionnaire that you're trying for the first time, you usually pre-test the questionnaire. What you do is you'll go out, let's say you're going to do a sample of, say, 1,000, whatever it'll be. You'll do 50 interviews, and essentially what you're doing as you run those interviews, you monitor them carefully, and you make sure that the respondents understand the questions and that the flow of the questionnaire works as you intended it to work. Now, how do you create a questionnaire for a survey? You're going to get a kick out of the answer. Exactly the same way you did for the focus group. It's the exact same structure, folks, except there are a couple of little add-ons, but it's essentially the same idea. You start with an introduction. Now, in the introduction, here you have to, just as you did in the focus group, you have to explain the purpose of the research. In the focus group project, you would do that when you're recruiting, and in a sense, when the respondent answers the phone or opens the mail or gets an indication that there's a survey on the web, what you write in the introduction is essentially the same kind of thing as what you did in the introduction to focus. You're essentially persuading the respondent, rather, the survey respondent, that this is something important. It's not a sales pitch. It's not a marketing thing. It's all about research. It's important, and it will be very, very helpful, and won't take a lot of their time. So you have an introduction. You have the same kind of structures you did in the focus group, introductory questions, easy questions to get people into the process. Now, there's something called screening and filtering questions, more on that in a minute. The most important kinds of questions, we talked about this in class last time, are rating questions. You have probing questions, and finally, you have demographic questions. Now, let's talk about some of the types of questions. We really explain the introductory questions. No need to do much more with that. Just an example that I created when I set up the charts. You kind of ask people, let's say you're doing a survey that has to do with interest in sports. So you might ask them how interested they are in sports, just to get them into the process. Filtering and screening questions. These are more interesting questions. This kind of establishes their qualifications, responding qualifications to answer subsequent questions. You might ask the extent to which a respondent is a football fan, or you might ask the extent to which a respondent watches sports on TV. What's really going on here is you're qualifying the respondent for the survey. You're doing a survey about, let's say you're doing a survey on the Super Bowl, and you're doing a survey for Fox Sports, and you want to find out reactions to the telecast. They didn't watch the reaction, they didn't watch the telecast, there's nothing to ask them. So the first thing you might ask, did you watch the Super Bowl? And if they say no, say thanks, goodbye, nice talking to you. You might ask why not, what did they do? But essentially, they're not going to get the questionnaire. So that's a filtering, and that's a kind of a screening questions. All right. Now, rating questions, these are, I said, the most important kinds of questions that there are. And here's where you're asking people whether they agree or disagree with statements, the level of satisfaction they have. You might give them scales. My favorite kind of rating question is a 4-point scale, but you can have 2-point scales, 3-point scales, all sorts of scales. My favorite's the 4-point, where you do very good, good, fair, and poor. But there can be good and not. There could be situations when it's appropriate to have a 2-point scale, where you're essentially just asking a yes or no type question. Generally, you want to avoid them, but once in a while, there is a place for them. There's a 3-point scale for good, fair, and poor. A little harder to interpret that. 5-point scales, again, hard to interpret because there are essentially 3 positives and 2 negatives in a 5-point scale. Excellent, very good, and good are positives, fair and poor are negatives. Now, sometimes in the 5-point scale, what you'll do is you'll have excellent, very good, neutral, fair, and poor. That's another way of constructing a 5-point scale. There are questions that are coded where the respondent isn't given the answer categories, but the interviewer has a set of responses. And so based on the answer, the interviewer just checks off a box. That happens frequently. And then you have probing questions, sometimes used to follow up, and these are usually open-ended questions. And what happens here, depending on the nature of the instrument, if it's a mail questionnaire, the respondent might write something. If it's an internet questionnaire, they might type something. If it's a phone questionnaire, so there are a couple of techniques that can be used. Sometimes the survey firm will have recording technology in place, and they'll just record the respondent's answer and have it transcribed either automatically or by a transcriber, and you'll get text that way. And sometimes the interviewer will jot down as close as possible to word for word as he or she can do it, the answer that the respondent gives. Finally, we have demographic questions. These are the questions that you almost always see at the end, very rarely any other place in the questionnaire. These are questions that deal with things like gender, age, income, education, race, ethnicity. These are questions that sometimes make people a little squeamish, so that's why you put them, that's why you always have them at the end. People call you up and they want to know your income. That's a sensitive kind of issue for some people. Age can be a sensitive issue for some people, ethnicity, whatever. So these are all the kinds of things that you put at the end of a questionnaire. Let's talk for a couple of seconds about the assignment that we're going to do this week. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create an online survey. And what I'm going to ask each of the research teams to do is come up with 10 questions, where you write the questions and the answer categories. We're going to do this by dividing the subject matter into 3 sections. And those sections are satisfaction, involvement, and communication. And here's how we'll do it. The first set, the folks who usually sit on the left side of the room, Tori, that was your group, we'll have you take on the satisfaction set. The involvement set, Nicole and company, you've got that one. And the final set, Yana and company, you've got the set that has to do with communication. So what you're going to do is come up as a group, as you did with the discussion guide, as a group come up with, so we'll make it 8 to 10 questions. 8 to 10 questions dealing with just your subject matter, and you don't have to write introductory questions, you just have to write the essential kind of questions, the questions that go into the heart of the survey, and we'll put it all together. You'll get it to me, hopefully you'll send it to me by Wednesday night, and I will put it all together and get you back a link hopefully by Thursday, and you can send it out to your friends and contacts, and by Monday the 28th we'll have data and we'll analyze it in class, and you'll have a chance to do in class to write a few paragraphs, a page or maybe a page long survey research report. And I hope you'll find it to be a fun exercise. All right, last piece of this lecture has to do with sample size. I've been talking all along about the fact that what differentiates quantitative research from qualitative research is the ability to project the data to the universe. And the reason this works, I've mentioned this a couple of times, is a concept called random sampling. Essentially, if everyone in a population has an equal chance of being selected, then you get into probability and statistics, stuff we're not going to talk about here. I'm going to show you how to read a simple chart that'll tell you how many people you need to put into a sample. Essentially, if everyone has an equal chance of being selected, you have the ability to project the data to the universe that's out there. Let's take CW Post, for example. So let's say we want to do a survey of all the students at CW Post. Well, we could perhaps figure out a way to get everybody involved in this survey, but we're not going to do that. We don't have the time, we don't have the money. So we're going to do a sample. We're going to draw a sample. All right? So the question becomes, how big does the sample have to be? And how do we do that? Well, here's how we do it. Here's the simplest way to do that. And it's not a simple random sample, it's what's called a systematic sample. So let's talk about the two, and then we'll figure, as we do that, we'll talk about what goes into actually drawing the sample. Now, in a simple random sample, essentially what you would have is you would have in a big hat, we'll call it an electronic hat, a digital hat, you would have 11,000 names, okay, or 11,000 file, whatever you'd have, 11,000 names that you would be drawing out essentially one at a time. And you would simply, have a list. Might be a numbered list, might be just a simple list. You throw all the names into this big bin and you pull out, shake the bin up, the whole deal, you've seen that. Shake the bin up and draw out the number of people that you need. And that essentially is a simple random sample. It's just drawing names out of a hat. And the number of names that you draw depends on the reliability and the validity that you want in your sample. More on that in a couple of minutes. Now, so what's a systematic sample? Why is that easier to do than a simple random? It's the same basic concept, but here's how it works. And here's why it's just easier to administer. So we know that at CW Post we have 11,000 students. So let's say we have 10,000, so make it easier. We have 10,000 students. And we're going to draw, I'm just going to define for simplicity purposes, we've decided that we're going to have a sample size of 1,000 students. And I'll explain how we got there in a bit. What we're going to do is essentially we're going to draw one name in 10. Okay, we need 1,000 names. We have 10,000 in the universe, 1 in 10. Much easier than drawing 100, than doing 1,000, selecting 1,000 names. How do you figure out, what's the complication? Is there any complication here? Yeah, there is. If you started at number 1, that wouldn't be random. If you started at number 10,000, that wouldn't be random. So what you do is you use what's known as a random number generator to select your starting point. It could be questionnaire, it could be student number 610. So the student who's numbered 610 will be the first student to be in the sample. Student who's numbered 620 is the second, da-da-da-da-da, and on you go. And that's how you would end up drawing your sample. It's a much easier way to go than the simple random sample. Now, the last thing I want to cover is determining sample size. How do you go about determining sample size? Well, there's a very simple principle that's involved, and that is bigger is better. What happens is this. I have a very neat chart that I'm going to put up on the screen right now that shows you what happens as you increase the size of your sample. Notice what's going on. If you have 50 people in the sample, your error rate is very large. And as you get down, say, to from 50, say, to about 500, every time you do you add in some more people, you really get some bang for your buck. And once you get to about 400 respondents, then you have data that's accurate plus or minus 5%. That's about the least you can ever expect in a survey. And what that means is as follows. When you draw a sample, say, of 500 respondents, everybody has an equal chance of being selected. You draw a sample of 500 respondents, and you get back, let's say, an answer to a question, how satisfied are you with the CW Post? And, the positives, both the very satisfied and the somewhat satisfied, let's say they come up to be, they total 75%. Well, what you really know when you have plus or minus 5% is that, in all likelihood, the real answer to that question is anywhere from 70 to 80%. Plus or minus 5%. So let's take a careful look at the numbers in the sample size calculator. To get plus or minus 5%, you need actually just a little bit under 400 respondents. If you get to 500 respondents, you're in the 4.5%, plus or minus 4.5%. When you get to 1,000 respondents, you're plus or minus 3%, and when you get to 2,000 respondents, you're plus or minus 2%. Now, the only column in the chart that really matters is the 50-50 column, because you really don't generally know how perceptions are going to fall out. If you really know that everybody's going to answer a question a certain way, if you ask somebody what color is the sky today and it's blue, you got a pretty good chance. If you ask somebody what color the sky and the sky is blue, you have a pretty good chance everybody's going to answer the same way. So there, if you were to, that would be the chart on the right, the column rather on the right, and there if you were to use 400 respondents, or 500 respondents, you'd be in the plus or minus 2% range. So just to sum up in terms of sample sizes, bigger is better. You get a lot of bang for your buck up until, say, about 1,000, and then the differences are not all that great. So 1,000 is a very interesting sample size to work on. 2,000 is about ideal. And if you look at the polls that are done, the public polls that are done in response to events and things like that, you'll see plus or minus 2% used very frequently with sample sizes of about 2,000 respondents. And this gets into, there's some complexities that arise here when you break up groups and you have, let's say you wanted to do a sample, or you wanted to sample for, say, students by class. So then you have to sample by each class has its own sample, and you put them all together, and it gets complicated, and especially when you're starting to deal with some big demographic groups. But simply stated, what you're dealing with here is bigger is better, and an ideal sample size is anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 respondents. Okay, so let's just review what we've done today. We've talked about the various types of surveys that are out there. We've talked about the differences between quantitative and qualitative surveys, the kinds of surveys that are out there. We've talked about questionnaire design, and we've talked about sample design. A real good guide, I hope, to survey research. And as I said at the outset, I'd be very interested in knowing your reaction to this lecture, whether it worked for you, whether you hated it, whether you loved it, whether you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, whether you'd like to never see it again. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a wonderful week. I look forward to seeing you 2 weeks from today. I'm recording this on Monday the 14th. I look forward to seeing you 2 weeks from today on Monday the 28th. And my phone's available until 7 tonight. I'll be online until about that time. And I'll be back online again Wednesday night after about 9 o'clock. Have a wonderful week, everybody. If you're celebrating Passover, as they say in Hebrew, Chag Kasher v'Sameach. If you're celebrating Easter, happy Easter. If you're not celebrating anything, have a great week. We'll see you soon.